This is Organized, the Business Law Breakdown, and I'm Professor Seth C. Oranburg. In this season, we're talking about corporations, and in this episode, we're diving into corporate finance. What is stock? What is debt? How do corporations raise money? And why owning stock doesn't mean you run a corporation. So let's get into it. Corporations don't run on hopes and dreams. They run on money. Money is the reason corporations go around, and the way they get money is generally by issuing stock. There are two big ways a company can raise money. It can issue stock, which is selling part of the company, so it's like a sale, or you could issue debt, which is a loan that needs to be repaid. And it's not a sale because you're not actually giving up a piece of the company, you're just creating a new obligation to repay. So we have these two major ways of making money come into the company, debt and equity. Again, when a company sells stock, it's issuing equity, it's selling ownership shares, it's selling shares of stock, it's selling a percentage of the company, and in return, the company gets money from investors. The investors get a slice of the company's future. Now, one thing to say up front, not all stock is created equal. We have common stock and many different kinds of preferred stock, and there's also dual class stock that has different bells and whistles, like Meta has super voting stock that gives insiders way more control. It's the reason Mark Zuckerberg runs everything, even though he doesn't have legs on the metaverse. But that's not the main point for our lesson today. We're not going to get super in the weeds with this introduction. I just want you to focus on the idea of the difference between selling equity and taking on debt. Because corporations need money, lots of it, and they raise it in these two different ways at different points in their life cycle. Selling equity or issuing stock means you are selling shares to investors, and immediately they purchase something. They get a certificate showing they have a percentage ownership in the company. This is how companies go public. So when Facebook had its $16 billion IPO in 2012, that actually seems like a small number in retrospect, but Facebook went public in 2012 and sold on that day $16 billion worth of stock to new investors. And they got a piece of ownership in the company. So what's the trade-off? Why not just print a bunch of certificates? Well, just like printing money, quantitative easement, the trade-off is you dilute control of the ones that already exist. So if you have 100 shares of stock and you print 100 more, you just decreased how much shares the original people had by half because you created twice as many shares. You sell too many shares, the founders lose power, unless they have some funky bells and whistles like Zuckerberg's super voting shares. On the other hand, you can take on debt. These are like bonds and loans. Instead of selling stock, a company can just borrow money by issuing corporate bonds, which are essentially IOUs where the company promises to pay interest and eventually repay the principal. The upside is that there's no dilution of control. You're not actually selling a piece of the company. The downside is that the debt must be repaid no matter how well the business is doing, or you default and go into bankruptcy. So why do companies pick one over the other? When would you issue stock? When would you take on debt? The mix of debt and equity, by the way, is called capital structure. So it's a fancy sounding word, and it just means the mix of how the company raises money. Getting capital structure right is an art form. Too much equity means the shareholders have very little profits per shareholder because they don't own very much of it. There also could be a lot of people who have control rights over the company who you don't want to. Too much debt means the interest payments will eat the company alive and it can't continue. So there's like a Goldilocks zone where there's just enough of each to keep investors happy and the business running smoothly. It depends on lots of things like what's the interest rate and what's the company's prospects. But we're not going to be making those decisions today. We're just be learning the rules that govern it. To give you an example, Tesla raised billions by selling stock. It didn't have any crushing debt payments, so it didn't have to worry about whether it was going to produce enough cars to make cash for a longer period of time. So equity is popular with startups that have uncertain cash horizons. Apple has borrowed billions of dollars because people figure Apple is going to sell iPhones and be able to pay them back. So its rate is dirt cheap. I mean, most people would rather lend their money to Apple than Sri Lanka. So it actually has a lower cost of debt capital than certain nation states. Amazing, right? Smart companies, of course, play both sides. They borrow when it's cheap. They sell stock when it's necessary. and investment bankers do a lot of the work figuring that out. Corporate finance isn't just spreadsheet wizardry. There's strict legal rules, so the lawyers are important here. Delaware has a few key provisions. Section 151 defines different types of stock, defines common and preferred. 160 presents the rules about a company buying back its own stock. It can do that under certain conditions. Section 170 governs when and if corporations can or must pay dividends, which is a kind of like percentage interest on stock. And when companies mess this up, courts step in. So a famous case is Dodge versus Ford from 1919. In that case, Henry Ford wanted to reinvest profits instead of paying dividends. The Dodge brothers, yes, those Dodges, like the competing company, who are also shareholders, sued, saying Ford had to act in the best interest of shareholders. They won for really weird reasons because Henry Ford went on this whole tirade about how he was doing this for the public good and how he didn't care about profit. So it's really a complicated story that we'll read later. But it is an example of how capital structure resulted in legal liability. More recently, Cayman versus American Express, 1976, the board decided not to sell a bad investment, so it avoided a financial hit on paper. And shareholders sued. The court said, nope, that's the business judgment rule. They were acting in a way that was reasonably calculated, reasonable for their business judgment, and so the shareholders can't complain. We're going to talk about the business judgment rule when we talk about corporate governance and shareholder lawsuits. And finally, in eBay versus Newmark, a 2010 case, Craigslist's founders wanted to run their company like a community service, but eBay, another shareholder, said no, you have to make profits. And kind of like a harkening back to Dodge v. Ford, eBay won and said, you're holding on to our money. You have to make profit. And it turned out they were right. We learned that in 1919. So where can corporate finance go wrong? Well, one is dilution. If a company keeps issuing new shares, existing shareholders get less and less control, and eventually someone else can take over. Debt overload is a problem because if you borrow too much, you can drown in interest payments. And dividends and buybacks can be an issue because although shareholders love to receive cash from dividends, not all companies can afford to pay them. And so companies can use excess cash to buy back stock instead, kind of buy off the shareholders that want to seek cash. Buying back one's own stock is governed by special Delaware rules. Some people think stock buybacks are just a way for CEOs to inflate stock prices and cash in on quarterly bonuses. Others argue that buybacks are a healthy way to return capital to shareholders. So there's controversy there. An example of a buyback gone wrong, by the way, is General Electric bought back $40 billion worth of stock. They bought the stock back at high prices. And typically as you reduce the supply, you would see an increase in the price, but the stock price tanked. The cash gone. Mistake made. Lawsuit followed. So what have we learned? The key thing for lawyers just getting started in the understanding of corporations is that corporations can raise capital in two different ways. And the major one that makes corporations different than partnerships is going to be issuing stock. Because unlike a partnership, a corporation has a separation of ownership and control. So you can sell ownership without giving up control, at least to a point. And stock represents ownership. It doesn't necessarily represent control. There's lots of ways to tweak this through the bylaws and the charter and the nature of the stock you sell. Of course, partnerships can also issue debt, but the partners are liable for the debt of the partnership, whereas in a corporation, the shareholders are not liable for the debt. Corporate lawyers often get involved with the doing of this issuance as opposed to the deciding between which type of way to raise capital, but it's crucial that lawyers understand the difference. And by the way, most lawyers will eventually either give loans or take loans or buy stock or sell stock and become investors. So these are relevant concepts for your life. So equity doesn't mean fairness. It means ownership. And ownership in a corporation does not mean control. Companies raise money through stock or debt. There are pros and cons. Corporate finance decisions have real legal consequences. So it's important to recognize what is actually happening. So with that, I'm Professor Seth C. Oranburg, and this has been Organized, the Business Law Breakdown. Up next, we're going to introduce corporate governance and prelude a whole season we have on that topic. See you next time.